$100 billion. That is what Masayoshi Son, the most flamboyant and controversial investor in tech history, has committed to building a competitor to NVIDIA. He calls it Project Izanagi, named after the Japanese Shinto god of creation. And Son has pointed out that the name also encodes the initials AGI, as in Artificial General Intelligence. Subtlety has never been this man's strong suit.
No, but I will say this. For the first time in several years, Son's audacity is backed by something genuinely real. Because buried inside this story is one of the most quietly extraordinary businesses in all of technology, and most investors still haven't fully priced it in.
Welcome to Asia Tech Macro. I'm Maya.
And I'm Alex. Today we are talking about SoftBank and ARM Holdings. We're covering how Masayoshi Son has quietly assembled one of the most strategically important positions in the entire AI value chain, and whether his latest $100 billion bet makes him a visionary or a reckless gambler one cycle away from catastrophe.
Let's start with the ARM story, because that is the real foundation of everything Son is building.
ARM Holdings reported its Q3 fiscal 2026 results on February 4th. Revenue came in at $1.24 billion, up 26% year over year. That was the fourth consecutive quarter above $1 billion. Royalty revenue hit a record $737 million, up 27% year over year. And non-GAAP earnings per share of 43 cents beat analyst consensus by 30%, ARM's ninth consecutive earnings beat.
Those are exceptional numbers, but the most striking data point is in the data center segment.
Data center royalty revenue grew more than 100% year over year, doubled in a single year. ARM's Neoverse CPUs, server-grade chips designed for hyperscale data centers, now have over 1 billion cores deployed across cloud infrastructure globally. Amazon's Graviton, Google's Axion, Microsoft's Cobalt, and NVIDIA's own Grace CPU, all of them are ARM architecture.
And ARM CEO Rene Haas said on the earnings call that he expects ARM's share among the top hyperscalers to reach nearly 50%.
Think about what that means. ARM started as the company that powers your iPhone. Now it's on its way to powering half the compute inside the world's largest cloud platforms. The business model is essentially a toll booth. Every time a chip ships with ARM architecture, whether it's made by Apple, Qualcomm, Amazon, or NVIDIA, ARM collects a royalty.
And the royalty per chip is increasing, not declining.
Exactly. As chips become more sophisticated, more cores, more AI performance, higher compute density, the ARM royalty per chip grows with it. CFO Jason Childs said on the call that their CSS, Compute Subsystem Royalty Contribution, has advanced from under 10% of total royalties to well into double digits, and he projected it could reach 50% within a couple of years. That is a massive royalty uplift.
And SoftBank owns approximately 90% of ARM.
Which is the key to understanding the entire SoftBank thesis right now. Son took ARM private in 2016 for $32 billion, tried to sell it to NVIDIA for $40 billion. That deal was blocked by regulators in 2022. Then he took it public again on NASDAQ in September 2023, where it is now valued at over $100 billion. SoftBank's 90% stake is worth somewhere in that range depending on the day.
That is a paper gain that completely dwarfs the losses from the Vision Fund disasters of 2019 to 2022.
WeWork, Catera, Greensill, those names feel almost quaint compared to what ARM is now worth, and Son is not done. On February 26th, SoftBank shares surged when Son unveiled the Izanagi strategy publicly, a $100 billion venture to build a vertically integrated AI semiconductor company. $30 billion from SoftBank's balance sheet, $70 billion from Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. The stated goal? Develop bespoke AI accelerators to challenge NVIDIA directly.
And the components of the strategy are already assembled. ARM for chip architecture, Graphcore, previously acquired for AI chip design, and Ampere Computing, acquired in December 2025 for $6.5 billion, which designs ARM-based server CPUs optimized for hyperscale AI workloads.
So the full picture is, ARM owns the architecture, Graphcore and Ampere build the custom AI silicon, and Izanagi funds and scales the entire effort with $100 billion. Masayoshi Son is essentially betting that the architecture layer of AI compute, the instruction sets and design toolchains that everyone builds on, is worth more than anyone currently understands. In part 2, we're going to dig into whether that bet is credible and what the competition looks like.
And who else wants a piece of NVIDIA's market? Stay with us.
So let's really dig into cooking. Because when I think about it, cooking involves so many different things at once. The creativity of deciding what to make, the technique of actually preparing it, and then that wonderful satisfaction of sitting down to eat something you made yourself.
And one of the things that makes cooking so special is that it's something you can share. Even if you live alone, you can cook for friends, for family. Food brings people together.
So true. Some of my best memories involve being in the kitchen with other people. My grandmother, actually. She used to let me help her when I was small. Even just stirring the pot or washing vegetables, I felt so useful.
Oh, that's lovely. And that's often how we learn to cook, isn't it? Not from books, but from watching people we love.
Exactly. And I think there's a phrase for that kind of recipe. Not written down anywhere, just passed on through generations. We call it a passed down recipe or a family recipe.
Yes, a family recipe. Something that's been made the same way for years and years. I have a few of those. My grandmother's apple cake, for example. She never wrote it down. She just knew it by heart.
Know it by heart is such a beautiful phrase. It means you know something so well, you don't need to check or look it up. You just do it naturally.
Like riding a bicycle. Once you know it by heart, you never forget.
And once you've made a dish many times, you start to improvise. You add a little more of this, a little less of that. You make it your own.
Make it your own. That's a great phrase. It means you take something and add your personal touch, your own style.
Cooking is also one of the best examples of mindfulness, I think. Being fully present in the moment.
Oh, I completely agree. When I'm chopping vegetables or stirring a soup, I'm not thinking about my emails or my to-do list. I'm just there, in the kitchen, paying attention.
The pasta reminds you very clearly when you've gotten distracted.
Ha! Nothing like the smell of burning onions to bring you right back to the present moment.
And there's a lovely phrase for someone who really enjoys being in the kitchen. We call them a home cook. Not a professional chef, not someone with fancy training, just a person who loves making food at home.
I love that term, home cook. It feels so warm and approachable, doesn't it?
It does. And home cooking often means comfort food. Emma, do you know that expression?
Comfort food. Yes, absolutely. It's food that makes you feel cozy and safe. The kind of food you want when you're tired or when you're not feeling well or when you just need a little warmth inside.
What counts as comfort food is different for everyone, of course. For some people, it's soup. For others, it's a bowl of rice or mashed potatoes or pasta.
For me, it's definitely soup. Any kind. When life feels a bit heavy, I make soup. It always helps.
That's such a perfect answer. For me, it might be pasta with olive oil and garlic. Very simple, very quick, but it always makes me feel better.
The simplest food is often the most satisfying, isn't it? You don't need a complicated recipe to feel nourished.
Nourished is a beautiful word. It means to feel taken care of, fed in a deep way. Not just full, but truly cared for.
And I think cooking does that at its best. It nourishes not just your body, but also your mind, your spirit.
Now, for anyone listening who might feel a little nervous in the kitchen or who thinks they're just not a cook, I want to say something. Cooking is a skill, and like any skill, you get better with practice.
That's so important, because I think some people give up before they really try. They burn something once, or their dish doesn't look like the photo in the cookbook, and they think, I'm just not good at this.
But the phrase to remember is, take it one step at a time. Don't try to make something complicated right away. Start simple.
Start with an egg, or a bowl of pasta, or toast with something nice on top. Build your confidence slowly.
And before you know it, you'll be the one sharing your own family recipes.
That's such a lovely thought.
All right, Contrarian Corner. Alex, I have been waiting for this. The data so far has been pretty grim for anyone hoping for a Western-friendly nickel supply chain. What is the counter-narrative?
Here's my contrarian view. China's dominance in Indonesian nickel processing may be self-undermining, and Indonesia may ultimately extract itself from Chinese capital dependency more successfully than anyone currently expects, and the timeline might be faster than the consensus thinks.
Okay, walk me through it.
The mechanism is economics. The whole reason Chinese companies invested so aggressively in Indonesian nickel processing was that it was extraordinarily profitable during the price boom. Between 2021 and 2022, nickel prices went parabolic, from under $15,000 per metric ton to over $33,000. Chinese smelters operating in Indonesia made extraordinary margins during that window.
And then prices collapsed.
Prices collapsed by more than 50% and have stayed suppressed. Partly because, and this is the irony, the Chinese-backed Indonesian expansion was so successful that it flooded the market. Global nickel production in Indonesia surged so rapidly that it overwhelmed demand growth, even from the EV sector. You can oversupply your own gold mine. And now several Chinese smelter operations in Indonesia are running at thin margins or outright losses, particularly older RKEF facilities producing lower-grade nickel products.
So China built a dominant position in Indonesian nickel and then may have inadvertently engineered its own margin compression.
And here is the strategic implication. When Chinese smelter companies are under financial stress, their bargaining position with the Indonesian government weakens. Jakarta is already moving on this. There are active discussions about raising royalty rates on nickel processing, tightening environmental compliance standards for coal-powered RKEF facilities, and pushing for more equity participation by Antam and other Indonesian state entities in processing operations. The moment Chinese capital is less profitable in Indonesia, the nationalist impulse in Jakarta gains traction, and Indonesian nationalism around natural resources runs very deep.
That reminds me of what happened in Zambia with copper mining. The Chinese dominant situation looked permanent right up until the Zambian government started renegotiating contracts. These resource-country relationships are more dynamic than they appear at any single moment in time.
Exactly the same dynamic. And the governments that successfully renegotiated did it by waiting for leverage, which in commodity markets means waiting for a period when producers need buyers more than buyers need producers. Indonesia is patient. They can wait.
There is a technology disruption angle here as well?
Yes, and this cuts both ways. The major trend in battery chemistry is a shift from NMC, nickel manganese cobalt, toward LFP, lithium iron phosphate, for mid-range vehicles. CATL has been scaling LFP aggressively, and CATL also announced a major ramp of sodium-ion batteries, which do not use lithium or nickel at all. If battery chemistry shifts accelerate, peak nickel demand in EVs may arrive earlier than the consensus forecast.
But doesn't that make the whole Indonesian nickel story less important, not more?
It reduces the growth trajectory, but it does not eliminate the demand. Nickel is still essential for long-range EVs, commercial vehicles, aviation electrification, and high-density grid storage. The demand is real. The question is whether it grows at 30% annually, as the bulls were forecasting in 2022, or at 10 to 15%, which is still substantial. And at 10 to 15% growth, Indonesia's dominance still matters enormously.
Okay, but here's where I want to push back on your contrarian thesis. You are saying China's position is weakening because of margin compression and Indonesian nationalism, but China has a countermove. They can just buy Indonesian government bonds, infrastructure contracts, port access. The economic leverage extends well beyond the smelter level.
That is a completely fair challenge. And it is true that Chinese economic influence in Indonesia goes far beyond nickel. Chinese companies have invested in Indonesian ports, railways, industrial parks. The Belt and Road footprint is real. But here's the thing. Indonesian public opinion about Chinese economic influence has been deteriorating. There is growing concern, especially among younger Indonesians in the political opposition, about the extractive nature of Chinese investments. Prabowo has been more assertive than his predecessor about demanding technology transfer and equity stakes in processing operations.
So the political economy inside Indonesia is shifting?
Gradually, yes. And here is the opening that I think investors and policymakers are missing. Indonesia has among the world's largest geothermal energy reserves. The country sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. If you could power Indonesian nickel processing with geothermal electricity instead of coal, you would simultaneously eliminate the carbon problem and create a supply chain that European automakers could actually access under their ESG frameworks and potentially qualify under a U.S.-Indonesian minerals agreement for IRA purposes.
So the path to a Western accessible Indonesian nickel supply chain might run through geothermal power, not just trade agreements?
Exactly. And there is already some movement here. Companies like Energy Vault and several Japanese industrial firms have been looking at clean power smelting in Indonesia. The capital cost is higher upfront, but the long-term competitive advantage, access to Western markets with premium pricing for low-carbon nickel, could justify the investment.
So the question for our listeners is, do you believe the grinding process of U.S.-Indonesian negotiations, combined with Indonesian moves to upgrade and clean up its smelting sector, will produce a genuinely accessible supply chain for Western buyers within 5 years? Or does Chinese capital's entrenched position mean this remains a Chinese-dominated story for the foreseeable future?
That is the $10 trillion question for EV investors and policymakers alike, and we have some specific action items coming in Part 4.
All right, let's bring this home. Alex, what are the action items for investors and business leaders?
3 things. First, for investors tracking the EV supply chain, Indonesia needs to be on your radar as a direct exposure, not just as a downstream risk. The most direct public market play is PT Aneka Tambang, Antam, which is Indonesia's state-owned nickel and cobalt producer. Antam has been building partnerships with Korean battery makers and has the government backing that gives it privileged access to Indonesian nickel deposits. Shares have tracked nickel prices closely, but the long-term thesis of a resource-sovereign Indonesia capturing more of the value chain from its minerals is structurally intact.
What about companies upstream in the EV supply chain?
For car makers, the clean nickel trade is where I would focus. Companies like Nornickel in Russia used to supply high-purity sulfide nickel with a lower carbon footprint. With Russia sanctioned, that supply has contracted. Australian nickel producers like IGO Limited have struggled with cost structures, but they hold a quality advantage. And there are junior miners in Canada and Australia with sulfide nickel deposits that would qualify for both US IRA provisions and European ESG standards. These are speculative, but the strategic value is high.
And on the Chinese-controlled Indonesian processing side?
Be cautious. Companies exposed to RKEF smelting in Indonesia are in a margin compression trade. High production, suppressed prices, rising Indonesian royalty demands, and tightening coal-fired emission standards are all headwinds. The boom time returns from 2021 and 2022 are not coming back unless battery demand growth dramatically outpaces supply, which would require LFP adoption to stall. That is possible, but it is not the base case.
Second action item.
For business leaders and supply chain managers in the EV space, this applies especially to anyone on an OEM sourcing team. Get honest about your nickel supply chain exposure, and specifically about which of your nickel sources will be both IRA compliant and ESG compliant by 2027 and by 2030. The answer for most Western automakers right now is not enough.
The compliance requirements are tightening faster than sourcing strategies are changing.
Nowhere close to fast enough. The H-Power route, high-pressure acid leaching using clean power, is the premium pathway to battery-grade nickel with lower emissions intensity. Indonesia has 5 H-Power plants operating today. Find out which ones are powered by renewable or geothermal energy versus coal. That distinction is going to matter enormously when the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism expands and when automaker Scope 3 audits intensify.
Do the due diligence now before the regulatory deadline forces your hand.
Exactly. And the third action item is geopolitical. Watch the US-Indonesia critical minerals negotiations very closely. This is arguably one of the most consequential bilateral economic negotiations of 2026, and it is getting almost no mainstream financial media attention relative to its importance. The outcome determines whether American EV manufacturers can credibly build a non-China dependent nickel supply chain, or whether they remain structurally disadvantaged versus Korean and Chinese competitors for years. The April 15th comment period closes for Trump's Section 301 review, and the May 5th public hearing is a key moment when Indonesian government representatives will likely signal their preferred framework.
If a deal gets done, some form of critical minerals agreement giving Indonesia FTA equivalent status for IRA purposes, that is a significant catalyst.
Both for US EV manufacturers and for Indonesian nickel producers. A deal would increase US demand for Indonesian supply, which supports prices, which benefits Antam and the royalty revenues that fund Jakarta's development budget. It is a rare win-win in trade negotiations if the two sides can work through the complications.
Okay, let me pull back and talk about the bigger lesson here, because I think this Indonesian nickel story illustrates something that goes beyond nickel.
Well, actually, let me rephrase something from earlier to make this precise. The China Plus One strategy was designed to reduce geographic concentration in supply chains, move factories out of China, diversify sourcing. And by the geographic measure, it has partly worked. More is being manufactured in Vietnam, India, Mexico. More mining is happening in Indonesia, the Philippines, Chile. But what the strategy missed was that capital can follow geography without changing the ultimate beneficial owner.
The factory moves to Indonesia, but the capital is still Beijing.
And until trade policy and investment screening mechanisms catch up to that reality, the diversification is somewhat illusory. This is going to be the defining supply chain challenge of the next decade. How do you achieve genuine capital-level diversification, not just geographic diversification? That applies to rare earths, to lithium, to cobalt, and to nickel.
The country that extracts the mineral is not necessarily the country that controls it.
That distinction is the most important analytical frame for critical mineral investing in Asia right now.
And for Indonesia, it is also a question of agency. They have built themselves into an indispensable position in the global energy transition. The question is whether they can use that position to build genuine long-term national wealth, or whether the revenue keeps flowing primarily to Chinese-owned processing companies.
Indonesia is aware of this question, and they are acting on it slowly but deliberately, raising royalties, pushing for equity stakes, exploring clean power processing. The arc bends towards resource sovereignty. The question is pace.
In our next episode, we are going to explore the other side of the critical minerals war, China's rare earth export restrictions and the Xi-Trump deal that suspended them. Beijing placed export controls on 12 heavy rare earth elements in 2025, key inputs for F-35 fighters and submarine propulsion systems. Then a deal was struck to suspend those controls for 1 year. What happens when that suspension expires? And is the U.S. anywhere close to building a domestic rare earth supply chain that could absorb the shock?
Stay data-driven.
Bye.